So the conversion of Emperor Constantine, it literally changed the world. It put the Roman Empire on a brand new path and made Christianity a global religion. But here's the big question that's fascinated historians for centuries. Was this a real spiritual awakening, or was it the brilliant, calculated move of a political genius? Let's unpack what the great historian Edward Gibbon found when he tackled this very puzzle. It all kicks off with these three words. This is one of the most dramatic stories to come down to us from the ancient world. You've got an emperor, he's on the eve of a battle that's going to decide the fate of the entire empire, and suddenly, he gets a sign from a new god. His biographer, the historian Eusebius, tells us that this vision, a cross glowing there above the sun, it wasn't just a random sign. Nope, it was a promise of victory that would launch him on his path to becoming the first Christian emperor, and really change everything. But as incredible as that story sounds, it's not the whole picture. See, when the historian Edward Gibbon really started digging into the sources, he found that this nice, simple story of a sudden conversion, well, it just didn't hold up. The reality was a whole lot messier. Okay, so here's the very first problem you smash into when you look at the evidence. If this was such a huge, life-changing event, you'd think everybody would agree on the date, right? Well, they don't. I mean, not even close. Just look at this timeline. The ancient writers put his conversion all over the map. One says it was right at the beginning of his reign. Another says it was just before that famous battle. A much more hostile historian links it to a family tragedy. And then you have his actual baptism, the official moment, which didn't happen until he was literally on his deathbed. That confusion right there is the mystery at the heart of all this. And the contradictions just keep piling up when you look at what Constantine actually did. I mean, on the one hand, he's still acting like a totally traditional Roman emperor. He's minting coins with the sun god Apollo on them, he's pouring money into pagan temples, and he's out there calling the sun his personal protector. But at the exact same time, he ends the horrible persecution of Christians, he gives them religious freedom, and he speaks about their God with real respect. He was, for sure, playing both sides. And this leads us to Gibbon's central insight, which he just nails with this quote. We can't think of this as a sudden flip of a switch. Constantine's Christianity has to be seen in a much more vague and qualified sense. He was treading very, very carefully through a religious minefield. So this takes us right to the core of the debate. If it wasn't some sudden miraculous conversion, then what was really driving him? What were his true motives? To get to the bottom of this, Gibbon tells us, hey, look away from the heavens for a second and focus on the cold, hard political reality of the Roman Empire. This was a world where religion and power were basically the same thing. Now, the Christians were definitely a minority, but they were a special kind of minority. Gibbon points out that most of the population, well, they saw a change of masters with the indifference of slaves, but not the Christians. They were organized, they were fired up, they were a unified party. And their faith preached obedience to the emperor. For a ruler trying to lock down his power, could you ask for anything more useful? And this quote just brilliantly lays out the appeal. I mean, think about it. A religion that literally teaches its followers that the emperor is God's chosen man on earth, that is an unbelievably valuable political tool. Constantine wasn't just getting followers. He was getting a loyal political base whose sacred text commanded them to support him. Okay, so how did this incredible mix of piety and politics actually play out in his official policies? This is where you really get to see the mind of a master strategist at work. His most famous move, of course, is the Edict of Milan. But you have to look closely at what it actually did. It does not make Christianity the official state religion, not at all. Instead, it grants religious freedom to everyone, Christians and pagans. It was a policy of toleration designed to bring peace, not to force one faith on the empire. And the wording is just pure political genius. The edict says its goal is to appease the deity whose seat is in heaven. Now, which deity is that? Well, it's left totally open. A Christian could read that and think, ah, yes, our God. A pagan philosopher could read it and think, of course, the supreme, universal creator. Constantine manages to please everybody without ticking anybody off. It's masterful. This balancing act didn't just win Constantine some political support. It actually started to fundamentally change the entire Roman Empire by creating a powerful new institution right inside of it. So what's this number? 1,800? According to Gibbon, that was the number of bishops who were running the Catholic Church across the entire Roman world. Constantine didn't just make an alliance with a belief system. He made an alliance with a fully formed, empire-wide network of leaders. And then he went and systematically gave these bishops real, tangible power. He upheld their elections. He made it legal for the church to inherit massive amounts of land and money. He even gave bishops the authority to act as judges in legal cases. And he backed their big councils. He was basically plugging a parallel government right into the machinery of his own empire. So after peeling back all these layers of legend and politics and power, what's the big takeaway from this incredible moment in history? And here we are, back at the final question. Was he a saint who saw the light, or a brilliant strategist who saw his chance? Gibbon's analysis suggests the truth isn't quite so black and white. Gibbon gives us this really profound insight into human nature. He basically argues that what we want to be true, what benefits us, often becomes what we genuinely come to believe. Our own interests can actually become the foundation of our faith. So what this really means is that the question itself is kind of a false choice. It wasn't saint or strategist. Gibbon concludes it was almost certainly both. It was a slow, gradual process where savvy political moves might have actually watered the seeds of a real, genuine faith. I mean, think about it from his perspective. This new religion tells him he's been chosen by heaven itself. And look, all his victories on the battlefield seem to prove it. Embracing Christianity secured his power and it justified his ambition. As Gibbon points out, when your self-interest is constantly being rewarded and praised, it can pretty easily grow into a sincere belief. And that one complicated decision left behind two gigantic legacies that we are still living with. For the Roman Empire, it was the beginning of the end of its pagan past. And for the Church, well, it was the moment it went from being a persecuted minority to becoming the most powerful religion in the Western world. It's really a staggering thought, isn't it? The world we live in today, our laws, our culture, even our conflicts, was profoundly shaped by the complex, maybe even ambiguous motives of one man almost 1,700 years ago. It leaves you with this one last, huge question. What if he had looked up at the sky that day and seen nothing at all? What would our world even look like then? Okay, let's dive into a really explosive chapter from one of history's most famous books, Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. We're going to look at what happened inside Christianity, the moment it went from being a persecuted faith to the most powerful religion in the world. You'd think, right, that getting power would finally bring peace and unity. But Gibbon shows us a story that is startlingly different. It's a classic, almost textbook case of the oppressed becoming the oppressor, and it happened with breathtaking speed. So picture this. It's 313 AD. The Edict of Milan is issued, and it's a huge deal. It promises religious freedom for everybody, a real moment of hope. But that hope didn't last long, not even close. Barely a decade later, Emperor Constantine, now convinced that he held the one and only truth, started using the power of the state to go after Christians who disagreed with his version of it. That great promise of tolerance was broken almost as soon as it was made. So what gives? How did that flip happen so fast? Well, Gibbon's take is that once the emperor got on board with the faith, he went all in. He adopted what Gibbon calls the maxims of persecution. He came to believe that anyone who dissented from the official Catholic Church was just being stubborn, and that a little, moderate severity was actually for their own good, to save them from eternal damnation. And this is the part that's just wild. We see the central paradox in plain sight. The very same church leaders, the bishops, who had once begged for religious freedom when they were the ones being oppressed, were now applauding the state for using its power to crush anyone who disagreed with them. The memory of their own suffering was, it seems, very short. All right, so the first major crack in this new Christian empire, It doesn't happen where you'd expect, like in Rome or Constantinople. Nope. It explodes out in the provinces of Africa over this bitter, bitter argument about purity and betrayal that would tear that region apart for the next 300 years. The whole fight was about this group they called traitors. A traitor was basically seen as a sellout, a bishop or a priest who, during the old Roman persecutions, caved and handed over the Holy Scriptures to be burned. The Donatus argued that the entire church had been polluted by these traitors, and that the only pure, true faith left in the world existed in their small faction in Africa. So, naturally, they excommunicated everyone else. And look, this wasn't just some theological debate. They weren't just writing angry letters. They were taking action, and it was intense. They treated Catholic churches like they were pagan temples. They literally scraped the walls, they burned the altars, and in this ultimate act of disgust, they threw the consecrated bread, the Eucharist, to the dogs. Okay, so the Donatus fight was brutal, for sure, but it was mostly contained to Africa. What comes next? This was a whole other beast. This was a highly philosophical debate, steeped in Greek ideas, that was about to rip the entire Roman Empire in two. It was an argument about the very nature of God himself. It's almost hard to believe, but this is the heart of the conflict. The thing that plunged the Roman world into chaos came down to a single letter in Greek. Was Christ homoousian, of the same substance as the Father, or was he homoousian, of a similar substance? Was he God, or was he a perfect creature made by God? This tiny iota of difference, as it was called, unleashed absolute mayhem. So, with the empire on the brink of tearing itself apart over this, what do you do if you're the emperor? Well, Constantine steps in. He decides he's going to settle this debate himself, once and for all, by calling a massive meeting of bishops to hammer out one single legally binding creed. And he does it in a big way. We're talking about 300 bishops summoned from every corner of the Roman world to the city of Nicaea. And get this, the emperor himself paid for their travel. This just shows you how serious this was. For Constantine, this wasn't just about religion. This kind of division was a direct threat to the stability of his empire. So at the council, the anti-Arian side comes up with a brilliant, and you could say a really clever plan. They choose a test word, a word they knew their opponents, the Arians, could never, ever accept: homoousian. It wasn't even a word from the Bible, it was from Greek philosophy. And it became, as Gibbon puts it, the sword they used to cut the Arians right out of the church. And it seems to work. At first, anyway. Arius gets the boot, he's condemned and sent into exile, the Nicene Creed is made the official law of the Roman Empire. Case closed, right? Well, not exactly. As we're about to see, the council didn't actually end the war. It just armed both sides for the next, even bloodier round. Yeah, so if you thought the Council of Nicaea would bring peace, you'd be dead wrong. In fact, things were about to get even crazier. The decades that followed were just pure chaos, where Roman politics and Christian theology became totally and violently intertwined. You can see the whole story just by looking at the life of this one guy, Athanasius of Alexandria. He was the biggest champion for the Nicene side. And just look at his career. Exiled 5 different times by 4 different emperors. For almost half a century, his life was just a constant battle, and he spent more than 20 of those years as a fugitive, all for defending his side of the argument. I love this quote from a Roman historian who was watching all of this unfold. He wasn't even a Christian, and he's just baffled by it all. He paints this picture of bishops just galloping all over the empire from one emergency meeting to the next, almost running the public postal service into the ground with all their travel. It was a frenzy. And this wasn't just about bishops arguing in fancy halls. This theological fight spilled right out into the streets. We're talking real deadly violence, riots, massacres. Over 3,000 people were killed in a single riot in Constantinople over who should be bishop. In Alexandria, the actual army had to storm a crowded church just to arrest Athanasius. The great cities of the empire became battlegrounds. And here is the craziest twist in the whole story. After decades of fighting,
The Arians were winning. The emperor at the time, Constantius, was on their side, and he put enormous pressure on the Nicene bishops to give up. It got so bad that at one massive council, the bishops finally buckled and signed a new creed that got rid of that critical word, homoousian. The result was so shocking that St. Jerome wrote this famous, incredible line, "The world groaned and was surprised to find itself Arian."
So, what's the takeaway from all this? After generations of this brutal infighting, what did it all amount to? Gibran leaves us with one last, powerful, and kind of mind-bending idea. Here it is, the final, brilliant irony of the whole story. The Christians were so incredibly busy fighting each other, literally killing fellow believers over a single vowel, that the final war against the old pagan gods had to be put on hold. Their own civil war, Gibbon argues, is what actually gave paganism a few more generations of life. Which leaves you wondering, what does it really mean to win when the victory is over your own house?
Let's talk about a guy who never wanted to be emperor. A philosopher, a general, who was forced to make an impossible choice. Become a rebel or become a victim. This is the story of how one man, Julian, made a desperate, lightning-fast gamble to seize Rome itself.
Okay, so picture this. It's Paris, 360 AD, middle of the night. And all you can hear are the shouts of Roman soldiers. They're not just cheering, they're chanting. They're making a demand that's going to either get them all killed or kick off a massive civil war.
So, who are they shouting for? Their general, Julian. And where is he? Well, he's trapped inside the palace. He's the guy who led these very soldiers to victory time and time again. But now, those same soldiers have him surrounded, swords drawn, declaring him the new emperor. So how in the world did it come to this? To get that, you have to understand the other guy in this story, his rival.
Yeah, the man on the throne wasn't some stranger. He was Julian's own cousin, the Emperor Constantius II. And their relationship? Well, let's just say it wasn't friendly. It was built on Julian's success and Constantius's deep, gnawing jealousy.
You really couldn't find two more different men. On one hand, you've got Julian, the junior emperor, the Caesar. He's out on the frontier in Gaul, winning battles, living with his troops, and they absolutely love him for it. And on the other hand, you have Constantius, the senior emperor, the Augustus. He's miles away, living in a palace, surrounded by yes-men who whisper poison in his ear, even mocking Julian as an ape in the purple.
In this rivalry, it got super petty. Constantius just couldn't handle Julian's fame. So get this, in his official letters to the public, he'd literally write Julian out of his own victories. He'd claim that he, Constantius, was the brilliant strategist behind it all, even though he was over 1,000 miles away. It was a complete lie. Everyone knew it, and it's what led to his biggest and ultimately fatal mistake.
So Constantius is watching Julian get more and more popular, and he's getting seriously nervous. He and his court decide they have to pull Julian's teeth before he gets any more powerful. And the way they do it? It's genius in a really sneaky, underhanded kind of way. It comes disguised as a perfectly normal military order. The order that comes down is a political dagger. It demands that Julian send away the absolute heart of his army, his 4 best legions, his most loyal, battle-tested veterans. The official story was that they were needed for the war on the Persian front, but everybody knew what was really going on. This wasn't about reinforcing the East. It was about gutting Julian's army and leaving him powerless.
So just look at the spot Julian's in. It is a total lose-lose. What does he do? Option 1, obey. His best troops march away, Gaul is left defenseless, and he's a sitting duck for his enemies at court. Option 2, refuse. Well, that's treason. That means instant civil war. He even thought about just quitting, resigning his post, but he knew that that would just be an invitation for an assassin's blade. He was completely, utterly trapped.
But here's the one thing Constantius didn't factor into his brilliant plan. The soldiers themselves. They were furious. They had been promised they would get to defend their homes in Gaul. Now they're being shipped off to the deserts of Asia to fight someone else's war? No way. They refused to be pawns. And so, they took the choice out of Julian's hands. Which brings us right back to that palace and the shouting in the night.
So now, he's emperor, whether he likes it or not.
And Julian knows his only chance of survival is to do the unthinkable. He has to strike first, and he has to move so fast that nobody will see him coming. What he does next? Well, it's one of the boldest, most audacious military gambles in Roman history.
Instead of a slow, predictable march down the main roads, Julian takes 3,000 of his best troops and just vanishes, dives right into the wilds of the Black Forest. For days, the Roman world has no idea where he is. Then, bam! He emerges on the banks of the Danube, seizes a fleet of ships, and sails 700 miles in just 11 days. He pops up at the key city of Sirmium so unexpectedly, he literally catches the enemy general completely by surprise. And just like that, he seizes the vital Suki Pass. The gateway to the Eastern Empire was now wide open.
You gotta love this next part. When the captured general finally recovers his wits, he has the nerve to call Julian's plan rash. And Julian's response is just ice cold. He basically tells him, "Save those timid warnings for your master. I didn't welcome you here as an advisor, I received you as a prisoner." Talk about a power move. The whole dynamic had flipped. Julian was no longer a cornered animal, he was the hunter.
So this is it. The stage is set. 2 Roman emperors, 2 massive armies on a collision course. The entire empire is holding its breath, just bracing for a bloody, devastating civil war that seemed absolutely inevitable. But then, fate intervened.
Yeah, that epic clash of titans everyone was waiting for, it all resolved itself in probably the most anticlimactic way possible. And suddenly, our philosopher general is on the throne he never even wanted.
The Civil War never happened. On his way to the front, Constantius, agitated, exhausted, comes down with a violent fever and dies. And in his final moments, maybe because he feared for the empire's stability, he does the last thing anyone expected. He names Julian as his lawful successor. And just like that, it was over. At only 32 years old, Julian, the so-called ape in the purple, became the sole, undisputed master of the entire Roman world. And he didn't have to fight a single major battle for it.
So the big question, what kind of emperor did this reluctant philosopher turn out to be? Well, one of his very first actions in the palace tells you everything you need to know. He arrives in Constantinople, gets settled, and decides, you know what, I need a shave. So he calls for a barber.
But the man who shows up is not a simple barber. He's this high-ranking official, dressed in magnificent, expensive robes, a perfect symbol of the palace's ridiculous waste and corruption. Julian looks this guy up and down, pretends to be shocked, and delivers one of the most famous zingers of his reign.
He says, "It is a barber that I want, and not a receiver general of the finances." With one sharp, witty line, he basically declared war on the entire corrupt, bloated system that his cousin had built.
And the bloat was staggering. We're talking 1,000 barbers, 1,000 cupbearers, 1,000 cooks. The number of eunuchs was compared to the insects of a summer's day. Get this. The cost of this domestic staff was actually more than the cost of the legions defending the frontiers. So Julian fired them, pretty much all of them. He cleaned house and sent a clear message: the party was over. Tragically, Julian's time as emperor was incredibly short. He was killed in battle in Persia just 16 months later. But his dramatic, almost unbelievable story forces us to ask a really fundamental question about leadership and power.
Think about it. Was Julian's greatness, his energy, his decisiveness, his courage, something he was just born with? Or was it forged in the fire of that impossible situation? Was he made a great leader not by his own virtues, but by the very injustice that was meant to destroy him? It's a fascinating thing to think about.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of history's most polarizing figures, the Roman Emperor Julian. And we're going to see him through the lens of the legendary historian Edward Gibbon, from his masterpiece, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So was Julian a philosophical hero or a dangerous fanatic? Let's get into it. So here's our roadmap. First, we'll tackle the enigma of Julian himself. Then we'll dig into his secret life as a pagan, explore his really clever war on Christianity, and look at his big attempt to build a pagan alternative. After that, we'll get to his riskiest move of all, rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, before hearing Gibbon's final, pretty shocking verdict. All right, so who was this guy?
For centuries, Christian writers painted him as the ultimate villain, a traitor to God. But for others, he was a hero, a philosopher king fighting a noble, losing battle for a forgotten world. And that's the core conflict we're going to unpack.
And this is the question Gibbon really wrestles with. Was Julian a truly wise and tolerant ruler, just trying to bring back some balance to the empire? Or was he, as Gibbon suggests, a man whose best qualities were totally clouded by enthusiasm, consumed by a kind of dangerous, superstitious fire? You know, history mostly knows him as Julian the Apostate. Now, an apostate is just someone who renounces a belief. It's a simple definition. But for Julian, that one word, apostate, would completely define his legacy, casting a shadow over every single thing he ever did. This quote from Gibbon just nails it. He's basically saying that the label apostate poisoned the well from the start. It forced everyone to see Julian only through the lens of his rejection of Christianity, instead of seeing the actual man, a guy with real virtues and also very real flaws.
So how does a Christian prince end up becoming the faith's most notorious enemy? Well, the story doesn't start with some grand philosophical debate. It starts with blood, trauma, and a life lived completely in the shadows.
You have to understand, Julian's path was basically forged in trauma. His family was massacred on the orders of the Christian emperor, his own cousin, Constantius. So for Julian, from day one, the religion of his family's killer and the idea of slavery were just fused together in his mind. So after being forced into a Christian education, he found an escape. At age 20, he was secretly initiated into the old pagan mysteries. And for the next 10 years, he lived a complete lie.
And I mean, what a double life it was. On the outside, he played the part of a pious Christian prince to perfection. You'd see him reading scriptures in church, fasting, even helping to build monuments for Christian martyrs. But behind closed doors, he was secretly burning incense to Jupiter and Mercury, losing himself in the philosophy of Plato and the poetry of Homer.
Julian's friend, the orator Libanius, gave us this incredible metaphor. He said Julian wasn't an ass pretending to be a lion. He was a lion who was forced to hide under the skin of an ass. Can you imagine the strain of that? Hiding your true, powerful nature under this constant mask of obedience and submission?
So what happens when the lion finally throws off the disguise? Well, the second Julian becomes emperor, he goes to war with Christianity. But not in the way anyone saw coming. No fire, no swords. His plan was something far more subtle, an artful persecution.
And here's what made Julian's plan so brilliant and so dangerous. He was smart. He'd watched his predecessors try bloody persecutions and fail miserably. He knew that violence just created saints and martyrs, and that actually made the church stronger. As Gibbon says, neither steel nor fire can eradicate the erroneous opinions of the mind. No, Julian's plan had to be way more insidious.
And this was his toolkit. Every policy you see here was like a precision strike. He issued an edict of so-called universal toleration, just to encourage all the Christian factions to fight each other. He banned Christians from teaching the classics, cutting them off from the intellectual life of the empire. Then he hit them in the wallet, yanking tax breaks and government jobs. It wasn't a head-on attack. It was death by 1,000 cuts.
But here's the thing. Julian wasn't just trying to tear something down. He was desperately trying to build something new. He had this grand vision of reviving paganism, not as the messy thing it was, but as a new, reformed, organized faith that could actually go toe-to-toe with Christianity. And his personal devotion, well, let's just say it was intense. Gibbon tells us Julian's piety was so over the top that he would sometimes sacrifice 100 oxen in a single day. It got so extreme it actually became a running joke across the empire that if he ever came back victorious from his war in Persia, there wouldn't be any cattle left. What's so wild about Julian's plan is that he basically tried to build a pagan church using a Christian blueprint. He saw what worked for them, what made them so effective, and, as Gibbon puts it, he beheld with envy the success of his rivals. So he wanted a professional priesthood, a formal doctrine built on Plato, and even state-funded hospitals and charities to compete with what the Christians were doing. But here's the beautiful irony. Most of the pagans, or Gentiles as Gibbon calls them, they didn't want this. They were perfectly happy with their loose, local, come-as-you-are traditions. They were, in Gibbon's perfect phrase, rather surprised than pleased by their emperor's new, demanding, and incredibly zealous brand of religion.
And that brings us to the most dramatic, high-stakes moment of Julian's entire reign. If he couldn't beat Christianity with organization, maybe, just maybe, he could disprove its core beliefs entirely. And to do that, he turned his eyes to the ruins of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, to really get what a huge deal this was, you have to understand the theology. Christian scripture, the words of Jesus himself, had prophesied that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed and never, ever be rebuilt. So if Julian could actually rebuild it, well, that would be the ultimate checkmate, a public, undeniable refutation of a core Christian prophecy.
So the project kicks off with this incredible energy. Jewish people from all corners of the empire flocked to Jerusalem to help. We're told the wealthy used silver tools and carried away the rubble in their own silk robes. They cleared the old foundations, ready to build. And then, something happened.
And the most incredible account of what happened next doesn't come from a Christian source looking for a miracle. It comes from Ammianus Marcellinus, a pagan, a soldier and a historian who was completely loyal to Julian. He wrote that horrible balls of fire kept erupting from the foundations, scorching the workers and making it impossible to get near the site. The project was abandoned. Was it a miracle? A pocket of natural gas? Gibbon doesn't claim to know, but he recognizes the power of the event, no matter the cause.
Julian would die shortly after this in his Persian campaign. His entire reign lasted less than 2 years. So what's Gibbon's final judgment? What's the takeaway on this brilliant, complicated, and ultimately doomed emperor?
Gibbon's final take is really nuanced. He absolutely gives Julian his due. The man had virtues, he was brave, he was a genuine philosopher, he was temperate. But Gibbon argues his mind was fundamentally clouded by superstition and zeal. And because of that, his policies were ultimately pernicious. They were damaging, throwing the empire into confusion and pitting his own people against each other.
And this right here is the final, chilling verdict from Gibbon. He argues that Julian's entire project was doomed. The Christian church was just too strong, too organized, too full of spirit. Had Julian lived, his artful persecution would have eventually failed, and to get what he wanted, he would have had no other choice but to plunge the Roman Empire into the absolute horror of a civil war.
Gibbon had his answer, for sure. But the question itself, man, it still hangs in the air, doesn't it? Was Julian the last best hope for the ancient world, or was his fanatical dream just one more force pulling a fragile empire toward its final, spectacular fall?